Okay, so let's dive in. We're looking today at a space that's really right at the crossroads, aren't we? Where deeply held religious beliefs, rooted in divine law, meet the actual lives of people within those faiths.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're zooming in specifically on LGBTQ plus identities within Islam.
And guiding you through this, is the source material you've provided. A paper, LGBTQ plus in Abrahamic Faiths, an Islamic Perspective on Compassion and Divine Law. It's by Dr. Grok Ibn Ai from the Pinnacle University, dated just June 2025.
That's the one. And our goal here really is to unpack that research with you, to explore how communities built on divine law, Sharia, and Islam, how they grapple with these, let's say, traditional interpretations, the prohibitions, while also looking for paths forward, paths suggested by the faith's own emphasis on things like compassion.
Right. So we'll journey through the Islamic texts first.
Yep. Then we'll look comparatively at Judaism and Christianity, touch on the really vital lived experiences of queer Muslims, examine that tension law versus mercy, and then see what the research suggests about paths to inclusivity.
And it's complex. The paper says so itself. It's a challenging area, definitely.
Not impossible. The research suggests there are ways to navigate it.
Okay, let's start with the Qur'an then. Where does the paper begin?
It goes straight to the Quran as Islam's sacred text, obviously, the foundation for morality and law. And the narrative that always comes up here is the story of Prophet Lut in English. You find it in Surah Al-Araf, Surah Ashar.
Right, and there's that specific phrase, isn't there, about approaching men with desire instead of women.
Exactly. And the paper points out that traditional scholarship, figures like Ibn Kathir, al-Tabari, they've historically interpreted that as a clear prohibition against male same-sex acts.
And sometimes extended to lesbianism too? How does that work?
Through analogical reasoning, or qiyas. Basically drawing a parallel. If A is forbidden and B seems similar in principle, then B might also be forbidden. That's the logic used sometimes.
Okay. And then there are the hadiths.
Yes. The sayings and actions of Prophet Muhammad. Some collections, like Sahih Muslim, do contain narrations mentioning severe penalties. But, and this is a critical point the paper makes, the authenticity of specific hadiths and how they should be applied. Well, that varies a lot between different Islamic legal schools. It's not uniform.
But here's where it gets interesting, right? The paper highlights something the Quran doesn't say.
Precisely. It points to the Quran's, silence on the idea of consensual, loving, same-sex relationships. The condemnation in the Lot story is framed differently by some.
How so?
Well, progressive scholars, and the paper mentions Amina Wadud as an example, they argue the story isn't about mutual love. It's condemning specific acts attributed to lost people, things like coercion, lack of consent, public indecency, maybe breaking hospitality rules, general transgression against God's messengers, not necessarily love between two people.
That's a significant rereading, and the paper brings up other verses too.
It does, like Surah Ar-Rum, which talks about spouses finding tranquility and love with each other as a sign from God. The paper notes this verse doesn't explicitly say man and woman. It focuses on the quality of the relationship. The love, the mercy, the tranquility, which raises questions, could that potentially include queer partnerships?
And overarching all of this
is Rahma, divine mercy. It's everywhere in the Quran. Every chapter but one starts in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. The paper really leans into this, suggesting that this fundamental compassion should inform how Muslims approach all issues, especially the complex ones. It provides a basis for dialogue, for understanding.
Okay, so that's the foundation within Islamic texts. Then the paper compares this to Judaism and Christianity, Islam's elder siblings, as it calls them.
Yeah, it provides that context. It mentions Leviticus 18.22 in the Torah, calling male same-sex acts an abomination, a very strong word.
But things have changed in some movements.
Definitely. The paper points to Reform and conservative Judaism embracing same-sex marriage. They often argue for prioritizing, broader ethical principles or understanding the text in its historical context rather than a strict literalism today.
And Christianity seems even more varied.
A real spectrum, yeah. You've got evangelical churches often citing Romans 1.2627 against same-sex relations, but then you have affirming denominations like the Episcopal Church ordaining openly gay clergy, focusing on Christ's message of love and inclusion above all.
So what's the key difference the paper highlights when comparing Islam to these?
It's structural, really. Islam doesn't have that central pope figure or the same kind of organized denominational structures you see in Christianity or even the established movements within Judaism.
Right. No Vatican, no Archbishop of Canterbury setting doctrine for everyone.
Exactly. So change or reform tends to happen differently. It's more decentralized. It might come from individual scholars or local community initiatives or grassroots movements pushing for change.
Which can be slower, maybe, or just
Sure.
more fragmented globally.
It can be. But it also allows for local adaptation. The paper mentions the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity, MASGD, founded in 2013. That's an example of Muslims creating these inclusive spaces, much like you see in affirming Christian or Jewish groups.
But the paper also makes a point, a very stark one, about the legal situation in some places.
Yes, and it's crucial to include this for accuracy based on the source. It notes the contrast. While these conversations are happening, many Muslim-majority countries have laws, often influenced by certain interpretations of Sharia, that criminalize homosexuality. The penalties can be severe, ranging from prison all the way to capital punishment in some instances. The paper reports this as a fact of the current legal landscape in those specific places.
Okay, so moving from the legal and theological, the paper then really emphasizes the human side, the lived experiences.
Absolutely. It stresses this isn't just theory. It's about real people navigating their faith and identity. It uses the example of Aisha, that's a pseudonym, a lesbian Muslim in London.
And her story is one of, trying to hold both identities.
Exactly. Deeply faithful, prays 5 times daily, fasts during Ramadan, values her hijab, but also loves her partner, Sarah. The paper says her story isn't unique. It reflects a growing community.
But it can't be easy. What challenges does the research say they face?
Significant ones. Potential rejection from family, maybe feeling unwelcome or excluded in mainstream mosque environments, even just social friction. The paper uses that evocative phrase, the occasional side eye from aunties at iftar.
Yeah, that paints a picture. So where do they find community and support?
The research points to specifically inclusive spaces, like Unity Mosque in Toronto is mentioned, and also, very importantly, online communities. Platforms like X are noted as places where queer Muslims connect, find validation, and build networks.
And how do they reconcile faith and identity? The paper talked about reframing.
Yeah, this is really insightful. It suggests many queer Muslims don't see their identity as opposed to Islam, but actually understand it through Islam, through concepts like Tawhid, God's absolute oneness and unity.
How do they connect?
Well, if God is the source of all creation and its incredible diversity, then perhaps that diversity naturally includes variations in gender and sexuality. It's seen as part of God's plan, not a mistake or a sin.
Like that verse about nations and tribes.
Exactly. Surah Al-Hujurat, 49.13, which celebrates God creating humanity diverse so that you may know one another. The paper suggests this can be interpreted broadly. If God loves diversity in cultures and peoples, why not in identities too? It even adds that slightly witty line.
Which one?
If the Almighty revels in diversity, who are we to quibble over pronouns or partners? It's a provocative way to frame it, suggesting human difference is divinely intended.
Okay, this leads us right into that central tension the paper keeps coming back to, the compassion versus the law.
Right. Islam's heart, you could say, beats with Rahma, that divine mercy we talked about, invoked constantly. But then there's Sharia, the divine law, which, in some interpretations related to this topic, can feel quite stern. The paper uses that analogy of the grumpy uncle, contrasting with the compassionate host.
It's a memorable image. And the reality is traditional jurisprudence, the fiqh.
Yeah, across different schools, Hanafi, Maliki, others mentioned in the paper, they do historically contain rulings prescribing punishments for same-sex acts. Now, the paper is clear that enforcement varies massively, historically and today, but the rulings are there in the traditional texts.
But there's a counter-argument within Islamic thought itself about the purpose of the law.
Yes, focusing on the maqasid al-sharia, the higher objectives or goals of the law. Things like preserving life, preserving faith, intellect, family, property. Progressive arguments highlighted in the paper suggest these ultimate goals prioritize human dignity, well-being, and justice over a purely punitive application of specific rules. The spirit over the letter, perhaps.
Does the paper offer historical examples to back this idea of flexibility or compassion?
It does. It mentions the Hijra community in South Asia, a historic transgender or third gender community. In some periods and regions, they weren't just tolerated, but held respected roles, like in royal courts or as spiritual figures within certain Islamic cultures.
Interesting. And poetry, too.
Yeah, medieval Islamic poetry. Figures like Rumi or al-Mutanabi. The paper notes some of their work contains what can be read as homoerotic themes or imagery, suggesting maybe a greater cultural acceptance or fluidity in the past that got somewhat erased by later, perhaps more rigid, interpretations.
So these examples aren't saying the law didn't exist, but that the culture and application might have been more complex.
Exactly. The paper uses them to, as it says, invite us to rethink divine law as a conversation, one where compassion might just steal the mic. It suggests the law isn't necessarily static.
Which brings us to the core provocation, the big what-if question the research poses.
Right. What if the traditional prohibition isn't solely about divine anger at an identity, but perhaps more tied to specific actions deemed harmful in a particular historical context, or based on human interpretations that could evolve?
And this connects to the Islamic concept of niyya, intention.
Precisely. A fundamental idea in Islam is that God ultimately judges our intentions, what's in our hearts. So the paper suggests, from this viewpoint, a queer Muslim's sincere faith, their prayers, their charity, their love for God, that niyyah might be what matters most in the divine scale, perhaps weighing more heavily than their sexual orientation or relationship choices.
It's a perspective that prioritizes the inner spiritual life.
It is. And the paper circles back to the examples from Christianity and Judaism here.
The affirming churches, the reform movement.
Yeah, showing that theological development, reinterpretation, it can happen within a tradition without shattering it. It shows precedence for evolution and understanding.
And Islam's unique structure plays a role again here, the decentralization.
Yes. While it makes top-down change hard, the paper frames it positively too. It allows for localized innovation. Grassroots efforts can emerge and experiment.
Like those examples mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The transgender pesantren religious schools in Indonesia or the Ibn Rushd Gotha Mosque in Berlin that explicitly welcomes LGBTQ plus individuals. The paper sees these not just as exceptions, but as potentially embodying Islam's inherent dynamism and its historical ability to adapt to new contexts. They're living examples of trying to bridge that gap.
So wrapping up our deep dive into your source material here, we've gone from the Quranic roots, looked across to other faiths, really focused on the lived realities which are so crucial, and explored that constant dance between divine law, Sharia, and divine mercy, Rahman.
And the central conclusion from the research, the main takeaway for you, the listener, is that LGBTQ plus believers in these faiths, particularly Islam, aren't errors or outliers. The paper calls them vibrant threads in a divine tapestry. It's a powerful image.
Yeah, it is. And the way forward, according to this analysis, it involves that careful balancing act.
It seems so. Respecting the scriptural texts and traditions, including the legal boundaries discussed, but letting that profound Islamic ethos of compassion and mercy guide the interpretation and the building of community. That's presented as the potential path toward greater inclusivity.
A path being explored now.
Definitely. And the paper suggests where more work is needed. Amplifying queer Muslim voices themselves, letting them lead the conversation, continuing to explore how Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, can be flexible and adaptive, and practically imagining and creating mosques and communities where truly everyone feels they belong.
And it leaves you with the final thought to ponder, drawing from the Quran itself.
Yes, from Surah Ashar. Verily, with hardship comes ease, a promise of relief after difficulty.
And the paper connects that.
It suggests, quite hopefully, that for LGBTQ plus Muslims navigating these complexities, perhaps that promised ease could manifest as finding a full, compassionate embrace within their own faith, tradition, and community.
A powerful thought to end on. Definitely something to reflect on further.